morning, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with BS Training, and I'd also like to welcome you to the webinar today. Our speaker today is Dr. Danelle Beckett-Weddle. Dr. Beckett-Weddle is an Associate Director at the Center for Food Security and Public Health at Iowa State University, where she has the privilege of working with and educating livestock producers, veterinarians, veterinary students, and the public about animal diseases and how to protect themselves and their livelihood. She writes guidance documents based on science and practicality, conducts engaging trainings, enthusiastically collaborates with industry, state, federal, and academic partners, and actively promotes awareness of the secure food supply plans for continuity of business. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Danelle.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm excited to share with you a year and a half's worth of work and the exciting things that are coming down the pipeline. We were fortunate to be funded through our Center for Food Security and Public Health in 2019 from the American Sheep Industry Association to develop the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. If you're familiar with the Secure Food Supply Plans, you definitely understand that they're a partnership between industry, our state and federal animal health officials, and academicians. So we at Iowa State, along with my partners, Dr. Renee Duell, Dr. Jim Roth, and the soon-to-be Dr. Clay McIntosh, would be the drafters of the content, and we would get that out to the working group. ASI put together a fantastic set of industry professionals, whether they were raising sheep on pasture, grasslands, feedlots. We had wool processors, we had packers, we had very engaged state animal health officials, federal animal health officials, and just a robust group that really provided some good review and some good critiques to make sure that the recommendations that were coming forth were things that were feasible, not easy, but feasible in a way that would protect their flock and allow us to think about business continuity. We released the content. It was just a year project in April of 2020, and then this past fall in October, we were fortunate to get additional funding from American Sheep Industry Association as well as USDA to kind of do phase 2, which is some of the outreach, and we'll share with you a lot of those resources today. So I'm representing our group at Iowa State, but I did not do it by myself by any means. So when we think about foot and mouth disease, it's honestly going to be a bigger disaster than what we experienced with COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 is a human disease. Foot and mouth is an animal disease. But some of the things that we learned, some of the market disruptions, that had some lasting impact, foot and mouth disease could be even more significant. So let's take those lessons that we learned in this past year and apply them and see how we can, keep our livelihood of our ag producers still going. So foot and mouth disease is considered the most contagious viral disease of livestock, and it's kind of the world trade limiter of all the animal diseases of either animals or their products. Now, this disease doesn't tend to kill adult animals, but you see the pictures on the screen. And so the UK in 2001, when they had their FMD outbreak, Korea and Japan in 2010, and Egypt in 2012, the death you see there is part of the control mechanism, the depopulation or the stamping out. Because it is so highly contagious, that's one avenue to try and get ahead of it. Animals will get pretty sick. Young animals can be killed from this disease just based on the strain and how it impacts them. So thinking about this animal disease, we want to look at it globally, just like these pictures show. So why are we concerned here in the United States? Well, this publication is almost 10 years old now, and at the time, OIE, or the World Organization for Animal Health, had 181 member countries. And you can see that 96 are endemic and have never been free of FMD, so 2/3 of the world. North America, we've been free since 1954 was the last outbreak in Mexico. The United States hasn't had an outbreak since 1929, and the last one was in California. In the U.S., stop movement and stamping out were the control procedures. And those are very much on the table when we think about FMD, in the year 2021 and going forward. But there are some other tools that we'll also talk about today. I think it's really important, the fact we're talking about sheep and wool, is to talk about some of the species differences. So if you're familiar with how FMD affects maybe cattle or pigs, it's a little different in sheep. So sheep are considered the maintenance host, and they're silent spreaders. They don't show a lot of clinical signs. Pigs are the amplifying host. They can spew, hundreds of thousands of particles, through different secretions. And cattle, we kind of call cattle the host that shows the most. So they're often the first species to show clinical signs. Now, the last row there talks about the carrier status of different livestock species. So sheep and goats, they can carry the virus for a while, and so it makes it tough with sheep. And this was one of the things as we worked on this project. It's not so much like, well, let's just take what we had from the others and switch a word here and there. You really got to think about the species variation. So in the recommendations that we'll share today in the guidance documents, we keep that in mind, that sheep are just a little different in how they show disease and how they spread FMD. This is not a disease that has any public health or food safety concern. It's very much an animal disease. So let's look at clinical signs in sheep and goats. Mild, if any. They can show a fever. They'll get lame because of some of the blisters that you'll see on their feet. Oral lesions, so you see pictured here the tongue of a sheep, and on the dental pad you can also kind of appreciate, some of the lesions that are showing up there, as well as some of the erosions on the tongue. But again, they're not very obvious that they are showing clinical signs. They might have some other symptoms of the clinical signs, so decreased milk production because they're not taking in as much food. Young animals can be killed by the virus due to cardiac infection. And on the adult side, might see some reproductive signs. So abortion, but anybody that's worked with sheep for any period of time knows that there's a big list of differentials when it comes to abortion in sheep. And then rams on the other side are reluctant to breed. So these are things to keep in mind, but it's going to make a little bit of the surveillance piece a little more difficult as we talk about this project. So how is FMD spread? So normal appearing sheep can shed FMD virus in bodily fluids like saliva or urine, manure, even semen 2 to 4 days before clinical signs appear. The thing with adults, again, we got to keep in mind is that they don't necessarily always show clinical signs, which makes finding FMD in infected sheep quite a bit harder. Again, just want to reiterate, FMD is not considered a public health or food safety concern. Infections in humans are very rare, and properly cooked meat and milk products from animals infected with FMD are completely safe to eat and drink. Next, we'll talk a little bit about what would happen if FMD were diagnosed in the United States. What would the response look like? So I'm grateful the USDA, they've released an updated version of the FMD response plan based on all of the things that have been going on the last several years. So if you look at the Red Book, it's got an October 2020 date on it. And we're going to talk about some of those things and how they impact the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. If you were to open up this document, it's going to talk about the capabilities needed and the critical activities that have to occur, in those first 24, 48, 72 hours of an outbreak. It's heavily focused on controlling and containing FMD on those infected farms that have been diagnosed, as well as suspect farms, those that have animals that might have clinical signs or being tested for it. And then contact farms. So did you share a rendering truck or a feed truck or employee? So what are those links between an infected farm and another operation? The goals in the FMD response plan did not change. It's to detect, control, and contain FMD in livestock as quickly as possible with the eventual goal of eradication like we enjoy today. In the document, it still talks about providing approaches to facilitate continuity of business for non-infected animals and products. So everything I'm going to share with you related to Secure Food Supply Plan aligns with those goals. So that, just like the other Secure Food Supply Plans, has not changed. The list of tools for controlling FMD, each of them has benefits and some drawbacks. And so stop movement is, again, something we used, 100 plus years ago when it was in the United States. And the response plan talks about a national movement standstill. We'll talk a little bit more about that next. Stamping out, again, very much a possibility when we get this disease. How can we contain and control it as quickly as possible? Biosecurity, that one is completely under the control of the producers. Things you do now to keep out domestic diseases can benefit you if this disease were to be introduced to the United States. Knowing what your contacts are, we talked about a contact premises, so trace forward and trace back of movement. Longest incubation period for FMD is 14 days. So the OIE, or the World Organization for Animal Health, says let's look at 2 incubation periods, so 28 days of movement. I have a hard time remembering yesterday, right? So, thinking about how do we know where things came from or went to, records are going to become very, very important. And those kinds of things that happen now, things to prepare, right, help you if this were to ever happen. Rapid diagnostics. We've got great diagnostics for animals that have clinical signs. So any blisters on the mouth or on the feet or teat end lesions, anything like that, we've got great diagnostics. We struggle a little bit for cattle and sheep on non-clinical animals. So that's one of the tools that needs to be more robust, and we aren't quite there yet in the U.S. And then finally, vaccination. Vaccination is described very well, and more resources were put into the FMD response plan. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today. There are some great webinars through the USDA's training and exercise program on their video gallery site. So I'd encourage you to look at that to learn more about FMD vaccination if you're interested. So movement restrictions of susceptible livestock species is one opportunity or one strategy for controlling and containing FMD. So a 72-hour national movement standstill of susceptible species, semen, embryo, and wool, is described in the FMD response plan, and it's something that's been exercised a few times between USDA and the state. So during this time, regulatory control areas around those infected premises would be designated. The infected, suspect, and contact premises will be managed under the guidance in the FMD response plan or the Red Book. Now, livestock operations that find themselves in that control area, so that pink or blue part of the circle on the graphic there, that are affected by movement controls but not infected with FMD, will need to kind of get back to business in order to have income, right? So the secure food supply plans, of which secure sheep and wool is one of them, can use the guidance in the secure food supply plans to help them work towards that. Again, the whole goal is to safely move. We don't want to be moving virus. And there are ways that we'll describe today to get people towards that end. So once the 72 hours passes, it's described, how would we move past that? The standstill could be lifted for those outside the control area. So secure food supply plans tend to focus on control area only. There are principles in here, enhanced biosecurity being one of them, disease monitoring being another, that can be used across the United States in an FMD outbreak, even if producers are not in that control area. But the principles we'll focus on today regarding permitted movement will focus on that control area. So, national movement standstill, how do we go about that? We've got a document that's available on all the secure food supply sites called Managed Movement in an FMD Outbreak. How do we handle susceptible species? So we're going to need several days to kind of get our arms around where this disease and where this disease isn't. And we've used the example of what happened on 9/11. Tragedy, absolute tragedy, what happened with the Twin Towers and such. But the principles of what happened that day when the FAA told the pilots, get yourself to the next safest destination, turn off your engines, and sit tight. We're not going to move for a few days. That's exactly what will need to happen in an FMD outbreak. Our livestock species that are on the road, get to your destination and stop. No new movements need to start for at least 72 hours so we can figure out where this disease is and where it isn't. That's one of the control mechanisms that has benefited many other countries and ourselves when we had foot and mouth disease all those years ago. Again, trying to detect, control, quickly contain, and work towards eradication. So once FMD is diagnosed, that control area is set up around an infected premises. Movement is by permit only based on risk. So the risk of moving live animals is a whole lot different than moving feed onto a farm, right? So we have to think through, there's different recommendations for different types of movement. The secure food supply plans are for farms that are located within that control area, so that pink or blue area, that are not infected with the disease, but they are affected by the movement control. This slide is to show, again, secure sheep and wool, maybe one of the last ones that has come along, but it's definitely benefited from all the great work. USDA now has put money into each and every one of these programs The National Pork Board funded part of the Secure Pork Supply Plan and continues to fund it as well. And then the American Sheep Industry Association funded Secure Sheep and Wool that first year and has continued to contribute along with USDA this year. You've probably heard, standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's really what happened with Secure Sheep and Wool. There are definite nuances with every species. So that's why it's important to put, together that great working group that we had and, chew through some of these hard topics. But again, we benefited so much from all the work that had come before us with other projects. So if you're interested in reading any of the Secure Food Supply Plans, they are all shown here on the screen. So securemilk.org, Secure Pork, Secure Beef, and Secure Sheep and Wool. They're only 7 to 10 pages long. They're guidance documents, not policy. We don't write policy. They are guidance documents for how to move live animals between premises and to packing plants or moving animal products to processing. Participation is completely voluntary, and each of those provides the resources to help producers protect their herd from FMD exposure. So let's dive specifically into sheep and wool. That's why you're all here today. So if you were to pick up this document, it's not very long. It's only 9 pages. You'll have an introduction. What is the purpose? All of the FMD response guidance documents that exist are referred to in here. Again, things are developed in lockstep. We're not trying to, do things differently. We've got to make sure that the main focus is that we are containing the fire as well as possible, but we want to make sure that we're not destroying the industry at the same time. So it's definitely a delicate balance, and that's talked about in this document. So managing movement of animals and wool, and then the guidance pieces. What can be done to prepare beforehand? We'll talk about that today. And then what some things might change during an outbreak and how that could be handled. And then permit guidance request information is also included. So let's take a little closer look at the permit guidance portion of this. So on the table before you, you see 5 areas. So this is for sheep, semen, and embryos. This is the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan. So there is a specific document about wool handling, and we'll talk about that next. So if you were to open up Secure Beef, Pork, Milk, you'll find these very similar categories, and it's what happened during high-path avian influenza outbreaks. All of these parts and pieces went into decision-making to make sure that we are moving business, right, moving the economy along, but not moving the virus along. So number 1 up there is traceability information. We've got to know what is being moved, how much, and to where. So having a premises identification number, that's the PIN up there that's abbreviated in number 1. 2, biosecurity, right? If you have infection, you're not eligible to move, right? If you're contact premises because you didn't have proper biosecurity in place, you're not eligible to move. So what can you do to protect that flock ahead of time and make sure that the regulatory officials that are issuing the permits are comfortable that you're doing the right things to protect that flock? Trace back and trace forward information. Again, if you're infected, suspect, or contact, you're not going to be eligible because that risk is too high. So what records do you have on day 0, right? Oh my gosh, I'm not doing much now. Maybe now's the time to start thinking about that, because when this hits, we want to make sure that we're finding where the virus is and where it isn't quickly. Number 4 is just like every single day, it's a business transaction. So if I am moving my lamb to a feedlot, or I am moving my finished weight animals to slaughter, I want to make sure that that next part of the business still wants my animals. What changes now is I'm in an FMD control area. I'm close to a fire, right? So the business piece of this, that conversation still has to happen. The next person in line might want a little more information about what are you doing to protect your animals so that you aren't bringing virus to their location. So things have to be accepted, and if you're crossing state lines with your animals or the animal products, then that state animal health official needs to be in that conversation with your state animal health official. So a little bit of this takes some time, and the more you're doing ahead of time to help protect your flock, the better opportunities that you'll have to request that movement permit because your animals will be protected. And then the last one, and I know we're all on virtual, you can't see all of my gray hairs, but surveillance or disease monitoring is what puts most of them there. It's tough, right, to find disease when we don't have clinical symptoms. And so when we think about, moving animals, that's a high risk. So our state animal health officials want some assurance that we're not putting animals into market or into movement channels that could potentially spread disease. Remember what I said about sheep, right? They don't show clinical signs well. So this one is tough, and we don't have good diagnostic tests yet, to find it in sheep. So this piece of it is one of the things that maybe challenged us the most when it came to business continuity recommendations. Now, if we have the tools to say, that population of animals doesn't have infection, then all of these things together would qualify that population or that flock for a movement permit. So remember that wool is not covered here. We'll talk about it next. So FMD virus can survive in wool. So that is the thing to keep in mind, is that raw wool can hold the virus, and it lives in organic material. So if the wool is dirty, there's dirt, debris, manure, whatever, it can live in wool for a period of time. So one of the guidance documents that was created was wool handling during an FMD outbreak. So there's guidance out there from OIE on international sanitary standards, the scientific research that's out there, and more work is being done. There's other countries doing some great work on this, so stay tuned. We might have more tools coming forward. But time and temperature are one of the recommendations that OIE has. So storing it for a certain amount of time for a certain temperature can help inactivate that FMD virus. Traceability of bales or bags of wool will be important as well, not resorting and combining with other farms, recognizing that a sheep could be shorn and wool moved before we actually knew that animal is infected. Again, because FMD is not always blatantly visible in sheep. So once it gets to its destination, keeping things from, commingling for a period of time will be important so that we can make sure we're not moving virus around. And then disposal options. So in the event that we are not going to move that product, this document talks a little bit about disposal options. So it's a detailed document for folks that want, the short, sweet, to the point. We just, hot off the presses, created this one-page handout with those same key points. So this will be posted on the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan before the week is out. So one of the things we talked about is preparing now. What can be done to prepare to better protect your flock, have contingency plans in place should FMD strike? There's a contingency planning document. It's about 6.5 pages, and it goes through different topics. So knowing where your inventory is, knowing what your next movements need to be. Maybe, it's the time of year where we've got to bring animals back in off of their grazing land, or maybe we're getting ready to move them. It's lambing season in a lot of parts of the United States. And so, where are those animals going to need to go? It talks through some of the things you need to think about and plan for. Financial planning, right? What about that next step, that next business arrangement, having those conversations? Protecting your flock through enhanced biosecurity is mentioned in here, as well as communication, whether that's your next business entity, your employees, your shepherds, whomever that's going to come onto your farm or might be transporting your animals should this disease occur. Sheep health, what are those considerations? Things might need to look a little differently. And then finally, managing inputs and outputs. There's a specific 3-page document that you can get from the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply website, and it goes through moving animals and feed and commodities and people and the markets and all of that, and makes you critically evaluate what do you need to move and how quickly, and could you do things a little differently? Could you go every other week? Could you make some of those adjustments if needed? And thinking through those things in peacetime before the chaos of an outbreak occurs helps you make better decisions. So I encourage you to look at some of the resources there. All right, traceability was one of the things I mentioned, and it was the number one. So getting a premises identification number or PIN. USDA's got a great website, and you can just go to your favorite search engine and type in USDA premises identification number, and this will come up. Click on your state. It'll take you to the office of your state animal health official or whomever in your state is in charge of assigning those premises IDs. for a 911 address where the animals are actually located. So getting those GPS latitude and longitude coordinates to the animals is important. Maybe you graze on separate pastures throughout the year. Maybe you're part of a public land grazing. All of those conversations, having those early are good because this is a free thing to do, but it's going to be required to request a movement permit. Maybe you already have one, so making sure it's up to date is also really important. So you're in the system should you need to be notified that you might find yourself in a control area. We are glad to create this document with USDA and American Sheep Industry Association and the working group partners. One of the biggest questions we got when we start thinking about sheep and identification is, well, how does this tie to the Scrapie program? So this document is, looking at the National Premises Identification Number. Some states have LIDS, location identifiers. And then there's Scrapie Premises ID. Oh my, right? A lot of different numbers, don't know what goes to where and how is it used. So this document, we just finished our review with the working group members, and we'll get it off to our ASI and USDA partners for its final look through, and then it'll be posted up on the website. But it goes through some frequently asked questions that we've gotten on, how do we use this number and what is it for, and, try to unravel the confusion a little bit. Mentioned trace forward and trace back, because again, permits are not issued to contact infected or suspect premises. So record keeping, you see pictured on the screen here, all kinds of record keeping forms. So if you don't have any, these are a great place to start, but you certainly don't have to use these. The parts and pieces that are on them are important. So maybe you look at them and go, oh, I don't track that now, I might add that to what I'm doing. You can do it on paper, you can do it electronic, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is you got to know what your contacts were in an outbreak. And so thinking, now in peacetime about how that might work for you is the goal. Mentioned, on the health side of things, we'll still want to have health records. We'll want to be looking at our animals in an outbreak and recording observations. You can find FMD. Not saying that you can. It's just more difficult in sheep than other species. So again, records are so important. Preventing potential spread, right? That really boils down to the producer side of things in an outbreak, just like it does in every day, right? We, as animal owners, are responsible for keeping our herds or our flocks free of infection. We do it every day when we make buying decisions or commingling or movement decisions. In an outbreak, our responsible regulatory officials are the ones that need to prevent spread. So they're the ones that come up with the permit requirements. Everything I showed you earlier are guidance, right? It's recommendations based on, things that have happened in the past and how a disease is spread and how we might mitigate that. But the regulatory officials will come up with the exact recommendations. Now, how do we prevent potential spread? How do we make sure that our flocks are eligible to even request a movement permit? Well, the things that we do today for routine biosecurity for common diseases is just not enough for FMD because it is so highly contagious. So we need to do things around enhanced biosecurity, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So how do we protect the flock? Well, these three principles, and if you're familiar with secure food supply plans, you've seen these before. Number one thing is write a plan specific to your operation and do it in peacetime. I didn't say implement every single piece of the plan. I said write it. There are things that you could do today that would help protect your flock from domestic diseases. So figuring those things out and how could you do those so you start to get in a rhythm and have a culture of biosecurity around your animals, doing that in peacetime makes it a lot easier when we get into the chaos of an outbreak. Second thing up there is a Biosecurity Manager. Right? We have flock managers, we have shepherds, trying to think about people that understand the operation, understand the animals, have them help write that and then monitor it. Right, and make sure that we're doing those things to protect the flock. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit more about this, is that concept of line of separation. Nothing crossing it that could introduce virus to your flock. Outdoor housed animals, it's more difficult. Right? I get that. But the principles behind LOS can be applied, and we'll show you some of those things yet today. So if you were to open up the enhanced biosecurity resources, they're all based on how FMD spreads. Producers can work with their veterinarian and use the self-assessment checklist an information manual, and a template, which is what you see right in the middle. It's fill in the blank, right? You can print it out. You can type it on your computer, whatever is easy for you to develop an enhanced biosecurity plan. And they're available for feedlots and for any animals raised out on pasture or grasslands or anything like that, all available on the Secure Sheep and Wool website. Let's next talk a little bit more about this concept of line of separation. So the biosecurity recommendation talks about this LOS, which is the red line on the screen around the operation. So it's limiting movement to where those animals might be exposed. The goal is to have something in place that separates an off-farm from an on-farm movement. So to visualize it, think of the operation as a castle, okay? And that line of separation is the moat. How can we protect our kingdom, protect our animals? Well, how do you cross the moat? The drawbridge, that's the access point. That's controlled by the operation. The operation decides when to lower it and let in any vehicle after it's done proper biosecurity, which may include cleaning and disinfection. So you see pictured there a livestock truck, right? We want to make sure that we aren't introducing virus. Now, in an outbreak, that livestock truck is going to have a permit to come to your operation. So somewhere along the line, some diagnostic tests have been run and observations have been done to make sure that those animals aren't actively shedding virus. But that truck might have picked something up. So we want to make sure that we're doing things to protect the flock. So this topic of cleaning and disinfection, every time we do these talks, becomes a challenge, right? People are like, how do we do this? And, you know, parts of the country have just come through a big deep freeze or the winter time, right? It's hard to do well. So thinking about where could you set up a cleaning and disinfection station? So this is separately funded, but benefits all the secure food supply plans is this cleaning and disinfection station video that the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship funded our center to complete. So how do you set one up around a farm such that, you know, you can do biocontainment if you're infected, which was the focus of this video, or if you're trying to keep disease off, how might you, clean and disinfect things so that you're not introducing? Making cleaning and disinfection the exception, not the rule, is the goal. So as you think about movement and that input-output document and where to put a line of separation, use that as a tool to set up a place where maybe you don't have to have things come on and drive by your animals. So ways to protect the flock. Now that might work very well for animals that, have access to buildings or closer to the home place. When we wrote the Biosecurity Information Manual, that concept, again, is it's complicated for animals that are grazing public lands. So there is no zero risk, and my slide got a little challenge there, but again, that should be a cross to the equal sign. There is no zero risk when animals are raised outside. Management decisions that we make in peacetime can bring some challenges when we deal with highly contagious diseases. So a brand new document, and this is the give back, is we developed a grazing public land allotment guidance document for the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan, and then, turned around and talked about it with the Secure Beef Supply working groups, because, this is part of how we're able to, use our public lands to feed our animals. But there's risks associated with that, and those are described in this document, and then ways to protect the flock. So the big take-homes with this document are working with the state animal health official and the livestock associations that are involved with permitting grazing lands, public lands, to discuss ways ahead of time to minimize exposure. So if we find ourselves in that situation, again, it's going to be kind of chaotic. We want to have those conversations early on. All right, so next let's jump to some additional website resources that are available either to help prepare or help respond if this disease were to ever occur. So on the homepage for securesheepwool.org, you can read the plan. We're going to have a video that comes out, so if you'd rather have someone narrate to you, that'll be available as well. And as foot and mouth disease, maybe you want a little more information about it, you can get access to resources there as well. We've got English and Spanish handouts for FMD and the Secure Sheep and Wool. They're just one page, so maybe you're doing a producer meeting or you've got an association newsletter you want to get some information out, these would allow you to do that. And those are both available on the securesheepwool.org site. If you are a producer, there's a variety of different resources. Some of them we've already talked about today. One of the new things that came out this year with the additional funding were some biosecurity signs. So under signs and posters, you'll find these 5 signs. Again, they're bilingual. Some are English and Spanish together, and some are one or the other. And then we're in the development of making 3 biosecurity posters as well, and those will be posted on this page when they become available. So again, just resources to try and help producers do things now to help protect their flock. Under the disease monitoring tab, it's a little light. If you are familiar with, for sure, the Secure Pork Supply Plan, there's a lot of resources being developed for disease monitoring in pigs. And again, because, sheep are just a little different, we don't have those diagnostic tests for non-clinical sheep. So the resources we have and more in development will be linked on the disease monitoring page. So unique aspects of sheep with FMD infection and husbandry are all going to be covered in a document I'm going to share with you next. Adult sheep may not show obvious signs. Young lambs may have death loss. But, we really have to think that there's no sheep side test today. So this was a bigger challenge for us to figure out, what does this look like? So this led to the development of a document called Factors to Consider for Biosecurity and Surveillance and Movement of Sheep in an FMD Outbreak. It is available on the securesheepwool.org website. One of the things that is in this document is because of these challenges, without the tools to find or no sheep side test, a non-clinical animal, is that stop movement and enhanced biosecurity are more important in secure sheep and wool than many of the others, right? It's important in all. But because we lack those diagnostic tests to give the confidence to our next in line business or to our state animal health officials or federal animal health officials, these guys might sit tight a little bit longer than some of the other species. So again, it's not without challenges, but it's, things that we've learned, and this document goes into great detail. So disease monitoring. There's a variety of ways to prepare, and we're grateful to our partners, Dr. Mohammed, Liz Fernandez. She's been great in getting us connected, Kathy Apicelli with the photographs. So we're collecting images from Plum Island. Dr. Mohammed is annotating those, and we'll have a poster because they do have clinical signs, right? They're just not as obvious, but we want to show you every possible thing that we can so people know what to look for so we can find it early. So that'll be coming as well. On the veterinary side, we've got a tab just for them, but it largely redirects to the biosecurity pages, disease info, vaccine, because it's all the same. We want veterinarians to work with their producers to help them learn what they need to recognize this and protect their flock. There's a section in there about the role of certificates of veterinary inspection, or CVIs, or health papers, in an outbreak. So permits are largely for control areas, but we're still going to have to track animal movement just like we do today. So that talks a little bit in more detail about the role of CVI. As far as the food side, right, the meat side of the sheep business and the wool side, there's a packer page, a lot of similar content to what we see in secure beef and pork, and the resources from the North American Meat Institute are also linked there. The wool handling documents I mentioned earlier, they're under the processor page, and then some product movement information on domestic and international based on, regulations that already exist are summarized on these pages. For our regulatory officials, a little more detail on some things. We use the term surveillance instead of disease monitoring. That's a term that regulatory officials are more familiar with. All the disease information is also available on their pages. There's a search tool at the top of each of these pages. You can type in just about any word you need, and it will land you to the information. So just giving you a little tour today of some of the things that you might find helpful. And lastly, we're all into this because of permit guidance, right? We find ourselves in a control area. We're not infected, but we're affected. How do we request that movement permit? So that table that I showed you early on that's in the document is also broken out on the web page as well. So you can find that under the regulatory officials page or the producer page. So let's talk about what's coming this year. So we're in the process of doing videos on the secure sheep and wool overview, so a shorter version of this webinar will be available, FMD as well. And then we've got a couple on biosecurity. Those are shorter, 4 or 5 minutes long. And then disease monitoring. What can we talk about and give producers tools that they can monitor for this disease? Spanish, as much as we can, we're creating this information in English and in Spanish, videos included. And then outreach articles. Maybe you're with the media, or maybe you have an association newsletter and you want to write a little bit about this. We'll have some different word count articles for you that summarize this program. All right. So lastly, I want to thank the American Sheep Industry Association for their initial funding and their continued funding this year. Thanks to USDA for all that you've put into the secure food supply plans over the years, and specifically helping fund it this year to get more outreach information. Thank you to all the working group members. If it wasn't for you, we were sending them a document a month. We got about 15 brand new things created for them in a year. So you guys were fantastic in making this all happen. And great big thanks to my colleagues at Iowa State, again, Drs. Duell, Roth, and the soon-to-be Dr. McIntosh, for all of their efforts as well. Our IT team, our designers, they all made this possible. So thank you for your time today. You can email us with questions at sswinfo@iastate.edu, and I'll also be glad to take questions today. Thanks, Liz.
Okay. We do have a couple questions that are already in the chat. Was radiation considered as a way to eliminate the virus from the wool?
Did you say radiation?
Yeah.
Excellent. So I would have to pull up the wool document to look through the list. I don't recall that as a specific recommendation from OIE, but again, I don't have that one completely memorized. But if you go to the Secure Sheep and Wool website, you should be able to find it. And since I'm still sharing screen, I tend to be a multitasker, so I'm going to pull up that particular document on the screen, and it goes through the recommendations from OIE on inactivating. Quick peek, right? Industrial washing, chemical depilation, I probably am not saying that correctly, fumigation with formaldehyde, industrial scouring, and then the storage for a specific time and temperature are the recommendations that are that come to us from OIE. So no radiation listed at this time.
Okay, the next question is, should producers of sheep milk refer to FMS?
Oh, excellent question. So there are probably principles in there that would apply. The things that we described today about, the differences in sheep, the way they shed virus or maybe don't show clinical signs as obvious is different than what you would find in secure milk, because cattle, again, they're the host that shows the most. So principles, yes, there's probably some cross-application, but there are definitely nuances for sheep and goat milk that would be different and things that we haven't really dug into at this time.
Okay, so here's a couple questions. Who is the guidance for, and who sets the policy that will be in effect?
Excellent question. So the guidance, so the Secure Sheep and Wool Supply Plan is a guidance document, and who it's for producers, and it's for state and federal regulatory officials. All were at the table when we had these conversations, and so if a state, and I'm going to pick on Dr. Jim Logan here in Wyoming. Jim was on our working group and just a fantastic reviewer and made things so much better. So if Dr. Logan is faced with FMD in his state, and he has sheep, obviously, and cattle, all the susceptible species, this is a tool that he could rely on as a guidance document to, what might we know about FMD in wool, and what kind of regulations should I put in place in my state. So definitely on the state side. From the USDA perspective, when we have FMD, it's generally a unified command. So we have somebody from USDA working side by side with somebody from the state. So again, it's a resource for them as well. For producers, right? This information, things that you can do ahead of time is 1,000% for producers. What can you do today to start protecting your flock? Premises identification number, enhanced biosecurity, all of those resources are in there. The word policy came up. We don't write policy. We write guidance documents. So any policy that is created would have to come out of the state or the USDA. So again, the policy is a whole different ballgame. This is just guidance.
So the other question as part of that is, how do producers find out what the planned policy is for their state?
Great question. So conversations, right? So on the secure food supply plans for the ones that are a little more mature, on the home page, there's a place that says state and regional projects. There's some states that are, diving into this very deeply. Others, maybe a little lighter, and some, might not be at all. And so having that conversation now with your state animal health officials as to, what are they thinking? What are some of the expectations that they may have in order to request a movement permit are good to have now. And especially if you're in a western state with public lands, that's one of the recommendations that came out is what conversations can you have today in peacetime that would talk about what is your business needs? How would you mitigate that in a disease outbreak?
Next question is, could some of these handouts be shared with state county extension offices so that 4-H groups and small producers would have some additional awareness?
That would be fantastic. And that's a lot of where those one-page documents are coming in is, just a short, sweet little handout that talks about the highlights and, the youth program. I have 2 kids in 4-H, and it's fantastic. What better way to start educating our kids about, ways to keep their flock healthy. So certainly anything that is available on the Secure Sheep or any of the Secure Food Supply sites is publicly available. And so download those and print them out or, link them into your 4-H newsletters. YQCA needs resources. Everybody is welcome to getting the information out to whomever needs it.
The next question is, can a contact premise be released from that designation through disease testing, or do they remain a contact premise for a specific period of time or the duration of the outbreak?
Well, that's fantastic. So I am,
yeah.
I am not a state veterinarian. I'm not a USDA veterinarian, so I will give you my interpretation of reading the FMD response plan. And if any of my colleagues from NPEC are on and want to type into the chat, that would be fantastic as well. So a contact premises, what that means is that you've had some shared contact. That might be you moved animals onto your location. You might have shared a rendering truck or a feed truck or employees, right? They might work at 2 different farms. So how do you not become a contact? Well, you have to do certain things that make sure that your animals are not becoming infected. So you can be a contact and through all the diagnostic tests and over a period of time figure out that, well, we might have shared that feed truck, but our animals are not coming up positive. So you would sit for a period of time, likely, incubation periods with more surveillance testing before you're released out of that category. So everybody that has susceptible species in a control area will be assigned a premises designation, be that infected, suspect, contact, monitored, or at risk, right? And so you might go from a contact to an at risk. You might go from a contact to a monitored, right? So if you are a contact, you're not eligible for a movement permit, so more diagnostics will need to be done. But typically, there's an end to that category. You might become infected or you might move to monitored. Great question.
Okay. And the last question that I have in the chat right now is, will Machado Labs Rapid Access Biosecurity app interface with SSWS as it does for swine?
I have no clue. So I am not familiar with that program. So I have no clue. I can tell you right now there is no, software program for Secure Sheep and Wool. The software is a website with all the resources. So how states will manage data right? Be that biosecurity plans or diagnostic results from their National Animal Health Laboratory Network, or their permitting system, be that a state system or the federal EMRS, the Emergency Management Response System. You know, data management is a huge part of all of these programs. There is nothing specific to sheep and wool that needs to integrate with anything yet, but definitely the states are looking at tools for how would they collect information from their producers. So while I'm not familiar with that, know that data management is a big part of all of these programs.
Okay, so we did have the person who asked the question sent in a link for the Machado Lab app thing. So that's there for everyone who wants to look that up. Do we have any other questions from our participants today? I hope we have another one. Has there been discussion about utilization of the secure food supply programs for movement outside the control zone?
Yes, actually, there's I don't want to say confusion because that maybe comes across as a negative, but when these were originally developed, and this harkens back to what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Well, egg came first because we developed the Secure Egg Supply Plan. University of Minnesota and Iowa State worked on that years ago. It really focused on control area movement, right? Not things outside a control area, because the assumption is, I showed that map early on, is once the control areas are designated, that movement would be restored outside of control areas. But there are principles in here that, you know, would help everybody. You know, we have to think in a couple of different compartments, right? So to get a permits, people feel most comfortable issuing a permit when you have a negative diagnostic test, right? So diagnostics and permits go hand in hand. We're not necessarily going to run a bunch of diagnostics outside of a control area, right? But what things can you do outside of a control area? Well, you can do biosecurity on your operation, because if we have FMD in the United States, where we know it is usually smaller than where we know it isn't. So how do you protect that flock? So there are principles in here that could be done, you know, outside of a control area. Having a premises identification number, if you are outside of a control area, but your next in line is in a control area, you're going to have a PIN to bring things in. So maybe that's feed. Maybe that is going to a feed lot. Maybe the wool processing plant is in the control area, so to bring things in. So you might not be in the control area, but because of that movement, you're going to need a premises identification number. So there's definitely parts and pieces of this that, you know, universally apply during an outbreak. But the main focus is around permitting, diagnostic tests, making sure we're not moving animals in an unsafe manner that could spread virus.
Okay. Do we have any additional questions? I have shared the link for Machado's lab thing with the participants. Right now, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So while we're waiting to see if anything comes through, on behalf of the National Training and Exercise Program, thank you so much for Janelle for presenting today. It was a great presentation. I know it's been a tremendous amount of work to get this done. We will be sending out additional announcements for upcoming webinars. And, you know, if anyone has any ideas of webinars that the VS National Training and Exercise Program can explore for our emergency preparedness community, please feel free to contact us. And you can always find other webinars that are recorded on a lot of different topics on the TEP video gallery online on the USDA APHIS website. And as we have no other questions in the chat, I would like to bid you a farewell for a great afternoon.